PR 8967. Mr. Ferlazzo is present with his attorneys before we bring in the jury.
Just one, Judge. Yesterday during Detective Fury's testimony, the state did end up admitting States 115, the PowerPoint presentation, and so but I hadn't given it to the court, so I did give it to Aspen for marking, and just wanted to be. Our stipulation says we weren't going to.
So that stipulation should be discarded? Wasn't there?
The stipulation just said, the stipulation is still about the chain of custody. It does say in it that it wasn't going to be admitted.
Right.
But the rest of it is important and still
All right.
in place, so.
But there's a piece we're going to have to tell them to disregard. Or just cross it out or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, I think we
You
could
may
just cross
want
it
to
out.
just redo it so it doesn't say it wasn't admitted.
I can do that.
Okay. Anything else to address?
No, thank you, Judge.
Chance? All right. Let's bring in the jury.
All right.
Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. Usual questions. Did anyone learn anything about this case since retiring yesterday and going home to your respective homes? Seeing all shakes of the head no. Did anybody read anything about this case? Did anybody watch any news accounts of the case since yesterday? Is there any reason why any one of you cannot continue to be a fair and impartial juror in considering all the evidence in this case? And receiving shakes of the head no from all 16 members of the jury. Is the state and defense ready to begin?
Yes, Judge.
Okay, call your next witness, please.
Your Honor, the state calls Dr. Stephen Shapiro.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence you shall give relative to the cause now under consideration shall be the whole truth for nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury.
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Hello.
Could you state your name and spell your last name, please?
Stephen with a V, Shapiro, S-H-A-P-I-R-O.
How are you employed?
Currently, I'm self-employed.
What do you do as a self-employed individual?
Mostly I do autopsies still.
In the past, have you worked as a medical examiner in Vermont?
I have.
When?
I started doing autopsies up here, I believe it was 1999. I started working full-time October 2001. They made me chief in 2006. I officially retired April of 2021, and then I worked for about a year and a half on a fee-for-service for the state of Vermont.
So in October of 2021, you were doing fee-for-service for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner?
Correct.
Before I ask you about some of those duties at the medical examiner's office, can you just briefly explain to the jury what kind of education and training one has to become a medical examiner?
Sure. Well, I did undergrad in medical school here in Vermont, graduating medical school in 1993. From there, I went to the Oregon Health Sciences University in Portland, Oregon, where I did a combined residency in anatomic pathology and clinical pathology. My last year in Oregon was spent mostly at the medical examiner's office for the state of Oregon in Portland. In July of 1998, I went to New York City, where I did a formal fellowship in forensic pathology. I stayed, I was hired on in 1999 as a full-time city medical examiner. I was mostly stationed in the Bronx County office. And then really after the towers, I moved up here.
So you mentioned that you were chief medical examiner here in Vermont. Can you explain to the jury what some of your duties were as the chief medical examiner?
Well, the Office of Chief Medical Examiner is essentially a government agency. We sit under the Department of Health. All what we do is derived by statute. It's VSA 5205. Essentially, we investigate sudden, unexpected, or violent deaths, deaths related to public health issues, some deaths required by law, prisoners, mental institution patients. But mostly I did autopsies. We have a big public health component of our work, monitoring, deaths in Vermont. So we did a lot of that.
Thank you. Can you explain to the jury what the difference is between cause of death and manner of death?
Sure. Cause of death is an etiologically specific thing. People die of atherosclerosis, heart disease, diabetes. These are specific diseases. Baseball bats, gunshot wounds. So, I always use Abraham Lincoln as an example. If I asked you what killed Abraham Lincoln, you'd probably say he was shot in the head. That's his cause of death. Now, if I was to ask you what changes or alters your biochemistry and physiology of having a lead projectile go through your head, you might tell me things like direct trauma, hemorrhage, shock. All these things are non-specific. Lots of things cause hemorrhages in your brain, whether they're strokes or bullets or baseball bats or aneurysms. So just saying, grandma had a brain hemorrhage doesn't really help us define what killed grandma. So that's cause and mechanism, and manner of death essentially describes the circumstances surrounding the death. In Vermont and most of the country, we only have 5 choices. Most of, most of us die of natural causes. And then we have suicide, intentionally taking your own life, homicide, somebody else did it, accidental deaths, and sometimes we just don't have enough information to classify the deaths in one of those categories, so we have the undetermined category.
Thank you. Approximately how many autopsies have you performed?
Honestly, I haven't kept track in a long time, but I'd say I'm around 6,000, the heavier side of 6,000.
Have you performed autopsies of individuals who have died of gunshot wounds?
Yes.
Can you estimate the number?
No, but gunshot wounds are a pretty common thing in a forensic pathology practice.
And have you been trained to determine if an injury is caused by a gunshot wound?
I have.
Were you involved in an autopsy in October of 2021 relating to a body that was discovered in a van in St. Albans, Vermont?
I was.
How did that occur? How did you become involved?
It was my day. When we're in the office, we usually just, at the time, we would, there was only one other associate I had, Dr. Bundock. So we pretty much split it by week. It was my week.
And how did the body arrive at the medical examiner's office?
The body arrived in a sealed trauma bag, and inside that trauma bag were, I believe it was 8 individual black garbage bags containing remains.
Were you, before I talk about details, were you able to identify that body?
We were.
Who was that?
Miss Emily Ferlazzo.
And how were you able to identify Ms. Ferlazzo?
Physical features and circumstances.
As part of the autopsy, was there any toxicology testing done to determine if Ms. Ferlazzo had any substances in her system at the time of her death?
Yes.
Were there any positive findings of significance?
I would say nothing of significance. There were some positive findings.
And what were those positive findings?
I believe there was nicotine, cotinine, a metabolite of nicotine. I think there was a little marijuana in there, and caffeine, I believe.
Did Ms. Ferlazzo have any alcohol in her system at the time of her death?
I don't have the report in front of me, but I don't believe she did, no.
Would seeing your report refresh your recollection on that?
It would.
So I'm showing you what's been marked as 113. Let me know if that refreshes your recollection.
Well, this is a copy of my autopsy report. It does not have the toxicology report attached to it.
I apologize. Was anyone else present when you conducted Ms. Ferlazzo's autopsy?
There were several people there, yeah.
At the start of your autopsy, did you do anything with the 8 garbage bags before you opened them?
All of the bags were x-rayed,
Were there human remains in those bags?
in some of them.
Which bags contained human remains?
It would help me if I had my report, but I believe it was bag 3 through 8.
And do you recall what was in each bag?
Not off the top of my head, no.
When you were able to open all of the bags, was all of Ms. Ferlazzo's, well, what was in the bags?
There was a dismembered body. All the anatomic parts were there, so it was a complete body.
Did you measure and weigh the body?
Yes.
How much did the body weigh?
There's no way I'm going to remember that, Counselor.
Would seeing your report refresh your recollection?
It would. So the combined weight of all the parts we had is 128 pounds.
So just so the record is clear, could Dr. Shapiro indicate what page he's referring to in his autopsy report and that the information is coming from the autopsy report? Thank you.
So This is from my report on page 3 of 7 under the external examination. I have her as an estimated length of 5 foot 3 inches and a weight of 128 pounds.
Upon inspection of the body, did you observe fatal injuries?
I did.
Can you describe those injuries?
Ms. Ferlazzo had 2 gunshot wounds to her head. The entrances were on the left side, the exits on the right side. She also had multiple post-mortem, after death, stab wounds.
Before we talk about that, I want to talk about the gunshot wounds. And you said left side. Is that Ms. Ferlazzo's left side of her head?
It would be, and if I could have my report up here, it would make me more comfortable with this stuff. Thank you. Entrance wounds on the left, exits on the right.
This may seem like an odd question, but how did you know that it was 2 separate gunshot wounds?
There were 2 separate gunshot wounds.
When you're viewing a gunshot entrance wound, is there a way for you to tell whether the barrel of a gun was pressed up against the skin?
There are.
How do you determine that?
So when we talk about gunshot wounds and range of fire, how far away the barrel was from the target, really there's only 3, basic kinds. Contact wounds, and this is all based on all the other stuff besides the bullet that comes out of the end of the barrel. There's gases, there's unburnt powder, there's burning powder, there's a lot of stuff that comes out, smoke. So if the barrel is pressed right up to against the target, all that other material goes inside the body. If it's a little farther away, not up against the body, we're able to see those particles that embed in the skin. We call that stippling. Sometimes there's smoke, fouling, and that can give us, if we go and test fire the weapon, we measure what's on the skin surface or the target surface, and then we can do test firing of the weapon to determine a range of death. If you move past the distance where those little particles and smoke travel, we call that, even if it's only 1 inch past there, none of that stuff is on the target, and all the wounds would look alike after that, whether it's 10 feet away or 150 yards away, because there's nothing there, and there is no way for me to determine the distance wounds, and there are other caveats involved.
Did you observe any of the stippling on Ms. Ferlazzo's entrance wounds?
I did not.
Would the presence of another object like fibers or cloth or clothing prevent stippling?
That was the caveat I was putting in there.
When you're viewing a gunshot exit wound, are there differences in how that appears during autopsy depending on whether the person's skin is up against an object?
There are.
And can you explain to the jury what that looks like?
So when a bullet's fired, it's spinning along like a football, a nice spiral pass. As soon as that bullet hits something, it begins to yaw or tumble. So if it'll go in with that nice spiral, it will make a nice round hole. As it passes through and it's tumbling, goes to the other end, and whether it comes out backwards, sideways, we don't know, and it lacerates, it tears the skin on the way out. If that skin on the exit wound is pressed up against something, When it lacerates out and the skin moves out, it smacks up against, and this all happens in less than a blink of an eye. It smacks up against that surface it's on, and it causes a little abrasion ring around it, which looks very much like an entrance wound.
Does the way that this looks depend on whether the object the skin is against is hard or soft?
It really just has to be a tight, something up against the skin, whether it's a wall, a chair, a bra strap, something that holds the skin together.
So to be clear, there needs to be some contact.
Yes.
Did you observe anything with regard to the 2 exit wounds on Ms. Ferlazzo that indicated whether or not her head was laying against anything when she was shot?
Both of the,
May we approach, please?
So, Dr. Shapiro, I just have to ask you, if you are going to refer to your report, which is fine, if you could just let us know that you're referring to your report and what page you're referring to.
okay, well, I don't think I was with those last 2, but on page 4 of 7 is the descriptions of the gunshot wounds. And in the 3rd paragraph under gunshot wound of entrance, marked A, in the 3rd paragraph, on the edges surrounding the wound is an approximately 1/8 inch ring of abrasions, parentheses, short exit wound. And on gunshot wound B in the 3rd paragraph, I described it as an approximately 1/16, there is an approximately 1/16 surrounding abrasion, parentheses, short exit wound.
So based on those observations, what were you able to conclude?
That Ms. Ferlazzo's head was against something when she was shot.
Were you able to determine a manner of death for Ms. Ferlazzo?
It was.
And what was that?
It was a homicide.
What is the definition of homicide in an autopsy?
Really, it's a medical definition, but it's really death at the hands of another.
Were the injuries from the 2 gunshots the sole cause of Ms. Ferlazzo's death?
Yes.
So we talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to ask some specific questions. In addition to the 2 gunshot wounds, you also indicated that Ms. Ferlazzo's body had additional injuries. I'd like to talk about the stab wounds first. How many stab wounds were on Ms. Ferlazzo's body?
There was a total of 18 separate stab wounds.
Page number.
That I just added up on the front sheet, the first page, under final diagnosis 2, postmortem dismemberment and stabbing, A, chest 1, abdomen 8, back 9.
Thank you.
Were you able to determine whether these 18 stab wounds occurred before or after Ms. Ferlazzo died?
I was.
How were you able to determine that?
So when you stab somebody or wound somebody in any way, you disrupt the small vessels, the microvasculature. Well, sometimes you disrupt big vessels too, but there's bleeding involved. The bleeding is really a result of having blood pressure. Your heart's beating, your vessels are all having a liquid under pressure. So when those vessels are disrupted, the blood essentially squirts out and causes hemorrhage surrounding those wounds. Ms. Ferlazzo's wounds did not have any evidence of that. Vital reaction is what we call it.
Are you able to determine how long after she died those stab wounds were inflicted?
No.
Were you able to determine what type of instrument was used to inflict those stab wounds?
The stab wounds, all had similar features. Once again, I'm referring to page 5 of 7. The stab wound of the chest had a blunted edge and a sharp edge. The stab wounds of the abdomen all had sharp edges and blunt edges, and so did the stab wounds of the back. Essentially, what this is a single-edged blade. If you take a blade, one side is flat and the other side is sharp. Pretty much any knife is like that, or most single-edged knives are like that. So when it goes into the skin, you'd see there's a blunt side and a pointy, sharp side of the wound.
When examining a wound on someone's body, is it possible to determine whether it's a slice wound or a stab wound?
Yes.
And how does a medical examiner make that distinction?
So essentially, by definition, these are what we fall under sharp force or cutting injuries. Incised wounds or slices are longer on the skin surface than they are deep. Stab wounds are deeper than they are long. And in a lot of situations, there's lots of overlap.
And in this case, were these incised wounds or stabbed wounds?
These were all stab wounds.
The one wound to Ms. Ferlazzo's chest, did that cause any other injury in her body?
It did.
And what was that injury?
I'm referring to page 5 of 7, under stab wound of chest. It perforates the pericardial sac, that's the sac around the heart, and causes the 3 distinct defects of the heart.
Thank you. Can you generally explain to the jury where the stab wounds were located on Ms. Ferlazzo's abdomen? I guess to clarify, were they scattered or were they linear?
They were sort of grouped. I described them as grouped, but the group was not, very tight.
And what about on her back?
The same thing.
I'm going to ask you some questions about the dismemberment. How many pieces was Ms. Ferlazzo's body in?
You're gonna make me count.
Page number, please.
Yep. So in bag number 3, this is on page 2 of 7. There was pretty much the left lower extremity minus the left foot. Bag number 4, same page, was Ms. Ferlazzo's head. Bag number 5 was an upper extremity and a foot. I'm on page 3 of 7 now.
May we approach?
Yeah.
You can continue.
Just to answer the question, there were 8 parts.
Were you able to determine whether the dismemberment of Ms. Ferlazzo occurred before or after she died?
Yes.
And what was the conclusion you reached?
This was post-mortem after death dismemberment.
Again, were you able to determine how long after she died that this dismemberment occurred?
No.
Were you able to determine what type of instrument was used to dismember Ms. Ferlazzo?
Yes.
How does one make that determination?
So this was a sharp-edged instrument making most, well, I won't even say that, making cuts. And then there was evidence of a serrated instrument used as well.
how does that manifest itself on the body?
So the serrated lesions essentially show abrasions at the cutting edge, which correspond to a serrated weapon. They look like serrations.
I'm now going to show you what's been admitted as States Exhibit 60 and 61. Is this the type of serrated edge that could make the marks that you saw on Ms. Ferlazzo's body?
It is.
And lastly, I'm going to show you what I've marked for identification as 113A and ask if that would refresh your recollection, and I'll ask one final question.
It does. 113A is a 4-page copy of the toxicology report from National Medical Services, NMS Labs, which is the company we use for a reference lab at the office.
And does that refresh your recollection on whether Ms. Ferlazzo had any alcohol in her system at the time of her death?
It does, and she didn't.
I don't have any other questions.
Ms. Jantz, any cross-examination?
Yes, thank you, Judge. Good morning, Dr. Shapiro.
Hello.
So you testified this morning that that the postmortem injuries, you could not estimate how long after death these injuries may have been inflicted, right?
That's correct.
You also testified that there was no soft tissue hemorrhaging, that is, accumulation of blood at the site of the injuries. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in order for that to, for there to be hemorrhaging, the blood has to have continued to flow when the injury was inflicted. Is that right?
Flow under pressure, there is gravity still works on liquid blood, but there was no evidence of vital reaction, Counselor.
And you remember my taking your deposition earlier in this case?
I do.
And we discussed this subject of how long after death you could estimate the postmortem injuries having occurred. Do you remember that?
I do.
And you mentioned that there were multiple variables that could affect how long the blood continues to flow through the body. Do you remember that?
That's correct.
Humidity was one of them, wasn't it?
Yep.
And temperature.
Temperature?
Yes. So in conditions of high humidity and high temperature, the fluid in the body dries up faster. Isn't that right?
I would say it's the other way. If it's moist, it will stay liquid. If it's the conditions around are dry, it tends to dry faster.
And you have no information about what the conditions were inside the camper at the time of dismemberment, do you?
That's correct, no.
And I did push you to estimate whether it could have been 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 hours after dismemberment, didn't I?
I don't remember exactly, but probably yes.
And you did opine that it was at least 5 minutes after dismemberment because of the lack of soft tissue hemorrhaging. Do you recall that?
I don't, but there was no soft tissue hemorrhaging. That would have happened pretty quickly once you stop having blood pressure and heartbeat. Yeah, I couldn't say with certainty how quickly after death that the postmortem injuries were inflicted.
Could you tell from the autopsy that you conducted whether the stab wounds were inflicted prior to the dismemberment?
I could not tell that.
So there, you couldn't tell what happened first?
That's correct.
So I'm just looking through your deposition testimony. And so, as you sit here today, do you disagree that it could have been 5 minutes after death that these injuries may have been inflicted?
Could be, yes.
Okay. I have nothing else, thank you.
Any redirect?
No redirect.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Does the state have any further witnesses?
We do not, Judge. Aside from fixing one of the stipulations, the state has no further evidence.
The state rests.
Yes.
The parties want to approach for a moment? So we'll take about a 10, 15-minute break and then we'll continue.
All rise.
Did you mean that I would make my motion now, or that we would have a break before the motion? I can do either one, whatever the court wants.
So let's let Ms. George listen. This way I at least get to see Ms. Johnson again.
I don't know, do you need one? Judge, could we do a 5-minute bathroom break?
Why don't you take 10 minutes, gather
Thank
your
you.
thoughts, and then we'll come back.
Thank you.